The silence in the radio room at Bagram Airfield lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds that felt like 4 years. The kind of silence that comes right before someone dies or gets saved, and nobody knows which yet. Captain Marcus Hale, SEAL Team 6, stood with his fist pressed against the plywood wall, staring at the topographic map like it might rewrite itself. His men were pinned in a valley the Afghans called the Wolf's Mouth, 12 clicks north of the Pakistani border, and every gunship, every drone, every fast mover in theater was either grounded by weather, refueling in Kuwait, or tasked to another grid square where generals cared more about the outcome. The storm had rolled in from the Hindu Kush like God's own curtain, black and furious, turning the mountains into ghosts. Hale's team had been running reconnaissance on a high-value target when the ambush came coordinated, brutal, professional. Now they were behind a crumbling compound wall with one working radio, 17 minutes of ammunition, and a sky that wanted them dead. The Joint Terminal Attack Controller kept cycling through frequencies, calling for anything with wings and ordnance. What came back was static, apologies, negative responses. Then a voice cut through. Female. Calm. Kentucky accent smoothed out by years of brevity code and adrenaline management. Sabre 1-1, this is Revenant 3-1, A-10C Thunderbolt inbound your position, 5 minutes out. The JTAC looked up, hope flashing across his face before training smothered it. Revenant 3-1, be advised weather is below minimums, visibility under a quarter mile, ceiling dropping. We've got AAA active and possible MANPADS in the area. Her reply came without hesitation. Copy all, Sabre, I've flown in worse. That's when Captain Hale leaned into the radio himself, breaking protocol because men were dying and he didn't care about radio discipline anymore. Revenant, this is Sabre Actual. Recommend you hold station. We'll find another way. What he didn't say, don't die for us. What he didn't say, we're not worth one pilot in this soup. The pause was shorter this time. Sabre Actual, Revenant 3-1. Respectfully, sir, that's not your call. I've got 30mm and Mavericks. Give me a target. Hale closed his eyes. He'd heard about her. Everyone had. Lieutenant Colonel Iris Revenant Cade, 34 years old. 377 combat sorties. A pilot who flew the A-10 like it was an extension of her spine, who'd once held station for 42 minutes over a downed Black Hawk while taking small arms fire, cycling gun runs until her rounds counter hit 0. They called her Revenant because she kept coming back, because she brought people home. The A-10 broke through the cloud deck at 800 feet, engines screaming in that distinctive turbofan howl, and for a moment she was just a shadow, twin tails cutting the gray like knives. Then she dropped lower, and the SEALs saw her fully titanium bathtub fuselage scarred with old bullet strikes, nose art barely visible through grime, the whole aircraft looking like something built to absorb punishment and still fly. Cade's heads-up display painted the valley in green thermal gradients, overlaying targeting reticles on anything radiating heat. She could see the compound, the tightening enemy cordon, the muzzle flashes strobing in infrared. Her right engine temperature gauge was climbing into the yellow, a hydraulic pressure warning flickering intermittently. Souvenirs from a near-miss RPG 3 days prior that maintenance hadn't fully resolved. She'd signed off the flight anyway. Some things mattered more than risk mitigation matrices. Sabre 1-1, Revenant has visual. I count approximately 40 enemy combatants in treeline southeast of your position, technical vehicles moving to cut off your egress route north. The JTAC's voice was tight. Revenant, confirm you're seeing 2 ZU-23 positions, grid November Delta 7428. Cade adjusted her flight path, felt the aircraft shudder as wind shear grabbed it, corrected with aileron and rudder, kept her speed steady. Confirmed, Sabre, I see them, marking now. She toggled the targeting pod, laser designating the anti-aircraft guns. They'd already started tracking her, barrels elevating, crews feeding belts. The math was simple and brutal. She had to kill them before they killed her, and she had to do it while flying low enough to identify targets in visibility that would have grounded any sane pilot. Sabre Actual, Revenant. Request clearance hot, danger close, guns and Mavericks west to east. Hale grabbed the handset from his JTAC. Revenant, we're within 100 meters of those positions. That's inside your frag radius. Her voice didn't change, didn't rise, didn't defend. Acknowledged. I'll make it work. Something in those 4 words made Hale believe her. He looked at his men, faces streaked with dirt and blood, eyes hollowed out by 18 hours of continuous contact, and made the call. Revenant, Saber Actual, you are cleared hot. God be with you. Cade rolled inverted, pulled the stick, dove toward the earth at an angle that made her warning system scream. The ground rushed up, rocky and unforgiving, and she pickled off 2 Mavericks in sequence, watching them motor toward the ZU-23 positions on pillars of white smoke. The Mavericks impacted with precision that would have made a surgeon jealous, turning the anti-aircraft positions into fireballs that rolled skyward, briefly illuminating the valley in orange violence. Cade pulled out of the dive at 300 feet, felt the G-forces crush her into the seat, tasted copper, kept the stick steady. Her right engine was screaming now, temperature gauge buried in the red, but she had unfinished work. She brought the aircraft around in a banking turn that put her perpendicular to the tree line where enemy fighters were massing for a final assault on the SEAL position. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon in her nose held 1,200 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium. Each round could punch through armored vehicles. Against personnel in the open, they were apocalyptic. Saber, Revenant inbound gun run, break, get your heads down. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. The Pipper settled on her HUD, targeting computer calculating ballistics, windage, drop. She squeezed the trigger and the Avenger roared, a sound like the sky tearing itself apart, firing at a rate of 65 rounds per second. The recoil was so massive it slowed her airspeed, the whole aircraft shuddering as the cannon vomited death downrange. The rounds impacted in a diagonal slash across the tree line, each one hitting with kinetic energy that turned Earth into fountains of pulverized rock and splintered wood. Thermal signatures on her display winked out, disappeared, stopped moving. She walked the fire across the enemy position with the precision of someone who'd done this so many times it had become muscle memory deeper than thought. When the gun fell silent, she pulled up, checked her 6, scanned for threats. That's when the right engine quit entirely. No sputter, no warning, just instant silence from the starboard turbofan. The aircraft yawed hard right, every instinct screaming at her to punch out, but she'd been flying A-10s for 12 years and knew this bird could fly on one engine if you had the skill and the nerve. She adjusted trim, compensated with rudder, nursed the throttle on the remaining engine. Saber, Revenant, I'm single engine but still in the fight. What do you need? Captain Hale stood in the compound yard, watching the A-10 circle overhead with one engine dead and the other pouring a thin trail of black smoke, and something shifted in his chest. He'd led men through Fallujah, through the Korangal, through missions that didn't have names because they'd never officially happened, and he'd learned to measure courage in calibrated doses. But this was different. This was a pilot with every legitimate reason to egress, to climb for altitude and safety, choosing instead to stay in the kill zone with a crippled aircraft because SEALs were still breathing and that meant the mission wasn't finished. His JTAC was already calling it in. Revenant, Saber 1-1, enemy QRF inbound from the east, 4 technicals with heavy weapons, ETA 3 minutes your position. Cade's voice came back steady despite the fact she was flying a 23-ton aircraft on 50% thrust in instrument meteorological conditions that violated every flight safety regulation ever written. Copy, Saber. I've got 2 Mavericks left and about 400 rounds. Let's make them count. She brought the A-10 around again, lower this time because she needed visual acquisition, and the ceiling was dropping with every passing minute. The technicals appeared through the murk, Toyota pickup trucks mounted with DSHK heavy machine guns, racing along the valley floor kicking up rooster tails of dust. They were moving fast, trying to reach the SEAL position before air support could react. They hadn't counted on air support with a death wish and the skill to back it up. Cade designated the lead vehicle, watching the targeting pod slave to her laser, waited for the seeker to lock. The Maverick came off the rail clean, guided itself down the laser path, struck the technical just behind the cab. The explosion flipped the entire vehicle sideways, sent it tumbling, secondary detonations as ammunition cooked off. The second Maverick took the trailing vehicle, equally precise, equally devastating. That left two technicals and she was down to guns. The enemy fighters knew it too, started taking evasive action. But you can't outmaneuver 30-millimeter rounds when the pilot firing them has 300 combat sorties in her logbook. The canyon walls amplified the sound of the GAU-8, turned it into thunder that rolled across the valley like judgment, and Cade walked the fire across the remaining technicals with the same surgical precision she'd used on the tree line. The first truck disintegrated mid-turn, chassis separated from bed, bodies tumbling in the explosion. The second tried to reverse course, driver panicking, and that moment of hesitation was all she needed. The cannon round stitched a line from bumper to tailgate, turned the vehicle into scrap metal and smoke. Her ammunition counter hit 0. Right engine still dead. Left engine temperature climbing because she was asking it to do the work of 2. Airspeed dropping, altitude marginal, weather worsening. Sabre, Revenant, I'm Winchester, single engine, and I need to climb before this weather socks in completely. What's your status? Hale looked around the compound. The enemy assault had collapsed. Bodies in the tree line, burning vehicles, silence where there'd been gunfire. His men were already moving, establishing a perimeter, treating wounded, preparing for exfiltration. Revenant, Sabre, actual, you just saved 12 lives, get yourself home safe. There was a pause. When she spoke again, something in her voice had softened just fractionally, the professional distance giving way to something more human. Copy that, Sabre. Revenant is egressing to Bagram. Good hunting. The A-10 climbed into the storm, single engine howling, and disappeared into the clouds like something out of myth, there and then gone, leaving only the echo of cannon fire and the smell of cordite. Captain Hale stood in the rain that had started falling, watching the sky where she'd vanished, and understood something fundamental about the kind of person who flies toward danger instead of away from it. His JTAC spoke quietly beside him. Sir, I've heard stories about her. They say she's been shot down twice, flew helicopters before transitioning to fixed-wing, lost her entire family in a car accident and joined the Air Force the next month. They say she doesn't know how to quit. Hale nodded slowly. Today I believe every story. The debriefing room at Bagram smelled like burnt coffee and frustration. Cade sat across from a full bird colonel whose name tag read Patterson, and whose expression suggested he'd been practicing disapproval in a mirror. He had the flight recorder data pulled up on a laptop, graphs showing her altitude, airspeed, engine parameters. Every violation highlighted in red. Lieutenant Colonel, you flew below published minimums, continued a mission with critical system failure, and conducted danger-close gun runs without proper clearance protocols. Patterson's voice was flat, procedural, the tone of someone who'd never had to make decisions measured in seconds while people died. Cade sat with her hands folded, flight suit still damp with sweat, hair matted from her helmet, eyes carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from flying combat sorties on pure adrenaline and will. Yes, sir. You're aware these actions constitute multiple violations of Air Force regulations and could result in grounding or disciplinary action. Yes, sir. Patterson closed the laptop, studied her for a long moment. The room was silent except for the air conditioning cycling and the distant sound of helicopters on the flight line. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, dropped the official cadence. Captain Hale called me personally, said to tell you that every man on his team is writing you up for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and they'll burn the building down if it doesn't get approved. He paused. Said you're the finest combat pilot he's worked with in 20 years of operations. Cade didn't smile, didn't react, just held his gaze with those steady gray eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by praise or intimidated by threats. I did my job, sir. Your job doesn't include flying a crippled aircraft in weather that grounded every other platform in theater. Now she did smile, but it was small, tired, edged with something that might have been sadness or might have been understanding of something the colonel would never quite grasp. "Respectfully, sir, yes it does. That's exactly what my job is." Patterson leaned back, recognized he was facing something he couldn't regulate or proceduralize, a kind of devotion to mission that existed outside the reach of military bureaucracy. The maintenance chief met her at the aircraft the next morning, early enough that the sun was still just a promise behind the mountains. Staff Sergeant Kowalski had been turning wrenches on A-10 since before Cade earned her wings, had seen aircraft come back from missions held together by prayers and physics-defying luck. But even he looked impressed at the damage assessment. The right engine was toast, completely seized, would need a full replacement. Hydraulic lines had been nicked by shrapnel, probably from the RPG near-miss days earlier. The port wing had taken small arms hits that nobody noticed because the titanium bathtub absorbed them like they were raindrops. The landing gear had stress fractures from the hard maneuvering. The entire airframe was beyond depot-level maintenance, needed a full teardown and rebuild. "Ma'am, how the hell did you land this thing?" Kowalski's voice carried genuine awe. Cade walked the perimeter of the aircraft slowly, running her hand along the scarred fuselage, touching the damage like a doctor examining a wounded patient. "She's tougher than she looks." "That's not what I asked." She stopped at the nose, looked at the GAU-8 cannon that had saved 12 lives yesterday, its barrels still faintly warm from use. "I trusted her to get me home. She trusted me to bring her back. That's how it works." Kowalski shook his head, made notes on his clipboard, calculated repair timelines that would keep the aircraft grounded for weeks. "You know they're talking about you in every ready room on base, saying you're either the bravest pilot in theater or the craziest." Cade turned to look at him, and her expression was complex, layered with things she'd never say in an official setting. "Those aren't mutually exclusive, Chief." He laughed, sharp and genuine, recognized truth when he heard it. "No, ma'am, I suppose they're not." She left him to his work, walked across the flight line as the sun broke over the Hindu Kush, painting the mountains in gold and amber. Other pilots were starting their pre-flight checks, ground crews moving with the organized chaos of a combat airbase coming to life. The call sign, Revenant, hadn't been her choice. It came from her first deployment, Iraq in the surge years, when she'd been flying Kiowas as a warrant officer doing reconnaissance and light attack. She'd taken fire over Sadr City, lost hydraulics in half her instrument panel, auto-rotated into a soccer field in the middle of a firefight. The ground unit she'd been supporting thought she was dead until she walked out of the smoke carrying her M4 and her maps, climbed into their vehicle, and talked them through an exfil route while enemy mortars walked closer. The infantry lieutenant had looked at her with something between shock and respect and said, "Ma'am, you're like a revenant. You just keep coming back." The name stuck. Followed her through flight school when she transitioned to fixed wing, through upgrade training to the A-10, through deployments to Afghanistan where the name took on new meaning. Because she did keep coming back, into valleys where others wouldn't go, into weather that grounded everyone else, into situations where the math said she shouldn't survive but somehow she found angles nobody else saw, made decisions that looked insane on paper but worked in three-dimensional space where physics met will. But the name carried weight she never discussed, because coming back implied leaving, and she'd left too many things behind to count. Her family's graves in Kentucky, all in a row, victims of a drunk driver on a rainy October night when she was deployed to Kandahar and couldn't even attend the funeral. The normal life she might have had, the husband and kids and white picket fence that her mother had wanted for her. The pieces of herself she'd traded for skill, for mission readiness, for the ability to fly into hell and bring people home. She carried photos in her wallet, parents, brother, sister-in-law, 2 nephews, but didn't look at them before missions anymore. That kind of emotional weight had a cost, made you hesitate when hesitation meant death. So she'd learned to compartmentalize, to put the grief in a box and lock it tight, save it for the rare quiet moments when she wasn't responsible for anyone's survival. The next mission brief came 48 hours later. Different valley, same war. A Marine recon team pinned down by mortar fire, requesting immediate air support. Cade listened to the coordinates, the weather report predicting thunderstorms, the intelligence assessment warning of increased enemy air defenses. She looked around the briefing room at the other pilots, saw them calculating risk versus reward, saw the moment several decided this one was too dangerous, too uncertain, too likely to end badly. "I'll take it," she said simply. The operations officer, a major who'd been in country 6 weeks and still looked startled by how quickly violence erupted, studied her carefully. "Revenant, you just came off grounding restrictions. Your regular bird is still down for maintenance. All we've got is a backup aircraft with known avionics issues." Cade stood, gathered her maps and flight cards, checked her watch to calculate time to target. "Then I guess I'll fly it old school. When's takeoff?" The major glanced at the wing commander, who nodded slowly, recognized that arguing with her was pointless. Some pilots flew because it was their job. Some flew because they loved it. And some, rare few, flew because they'd found the only thing that made sense in a senseless world, the only place where their particular combination of skills and psychology and willingness to trade safety for purpose had meaning. "Wheels up in 30 minutes. Try to bring this one back in one piece." She smiled, genuine this time. Chief Kowalski would appreciate that. The backup A-10 was older, more beaten up, had less sophisticated targeting systems, and a head-up display that flickered intermittently. But the engines ran, the gun functioned, and the wings would carry ordnance. That was enough. She ran through pre-flight checks with the methodical precision of someone who knew that skipping steps got you killed, signed off the maintenance forms despite the long list of minor discrepancies, climbed into the cockpit like she was coming home. The titanium bathtub wrapped around her, familiar and protective. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid and old sweat. The weight of the helmet. The stick in her right hand, throttles in her left. Everything simplified to inputs and outputs, threats and responses, the clean mathematics of survival. The Marine radio operator's voice was young, maybe 22, and fighting to stay professional despite the terror bleeding through. Any air, this is Phantom 2-3, danger close fire mission, taking effective mortar fire, multiple casualties, request immediate support." Cade had already contacted the tactical air controller, gotten the clearance, plotted the route. She pushed the throttles forward, felt the A-10 accelerate, nose rising as she climbed toward the mountain range separating her from the target area. The sky ahead was building thunderheads, massive towers of cumulonimbus that pilots normally avoided by 50 miles. She checked her fuel, calculated time on station, ran the numbers. Tight but workable. Phantom 2-3, Revenant 3-1, inbound your position, 12 minutes out. Describe your tactical situation. The Marine's relief was audible even through the static. "Revenant, we're in a dry riverbed, enemy positions on ridgeline to our north. Mortars firing from approximately 800 meters. We've got 2 urgent casualties and can't move until fire is suppressed." Cade acknowledged, began her descent into the valley system. The weather closed around her like a fist, visibility dropping to nothing, rain hammering the canopy, turbulence throwing the aircraft around like God was shaking it. Her instruments became her reality altimeter, airspeed, artificial horizon. Trust the gauges. Ignore your inner ear telling you you're upside down. Fly the aircraft. She broke through the cloud deck at 1,000 feet, found the riverbed, saw the Marines huddled behind rocks while mortar rounds impacted in steady rhythm, walking closer with each adjustment. The enemy gunners were good, professional, had the range nearly dialed. Another 2 minutes and they'd score direct hits. Cade didn't have 2 minutes to plan. She rolled into an attack run immediately, acquired the ridgeline, saw the muzzle flashes in her targeting pod. "Phantom, Revenant has visual on enemy mortar positions. Request clearance hot." The tactical air controller's voice cut in. "Revenant, be advised friendly forces within 200 meters. Recommend offset aim point." She was already adjusting, calculating wind, elevation, the precise angle needed to put rounds on target without endangering the Marines. The 30mm cannon spoke its brutal poetry, and the ridgeline erupted in explosions that silenced the mortars mid-flight. Cade pulled up hard, checking her six, scanning for anti-aircraft threats. The valley was a kill box, narrow enough that maneuvering was limited, overlooked by high ground where a competent enemy could position air defenses. She didn't have the luxury of careful approaches. She made another pass, lower this time, cleaning up secondary positions with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than conscious thought. Each trigger pull was a decision about life and death, about which thermal signatures represented threats, and which were just shepherds or farmers in the wrong place at the wrong time. The rules of engagement were clear, but reality was messy, and she'd learned to live in that gray space between legal authority and moral weight. When she pulled off target the final time, the valley was quiet, smoke rising from the ridgeline, no more incoming fire. The Marine radio operator's voice cracked with emotion. "Revenant Phantom 2-3, you just saved our asses. We're moving casualties to extract point now." She acknowledged, climbed back into the weather, felt the aircraft shake as she punched through the thunderheads. Lightning flickered in the distance, electric and beautiful and dangerous. Her fuel gauge was creeping toward minimum reserves. She calculated the distance to Bagram, added a safety margin, decided she had enough to loiter another 10 minutes in case the Marines needed her. That's when the call came through from a different frequency, different call sign, different crisis. Army patrol in contact, troops in the open requesting air support. Grid coordinates 40 clicks west. Weather even worse. Available response time critical. The Air Operations Center controller's voice was apologetic. "Revenant, we're Winchester on available assets. Closest platform is 30 minutes out. Can you respond?" Cade looked at her fuel gauge, did the math, understood what saying yes would mean. She'd be landing at Bagram on fumes, maybe flaming out on final approach, gambling that her calculations were perfect and the wind didn't shift and she didn't hit unexpected headwinds. She didn't hesitate. "Affirm, I'm en route. Send me the frequency." The controller paused, clearly running the same fuel calculations she'd just done. "Revenant, you'll be cutting it extremely close." "Copy. I've been close before." She banked west, descended back into the soup, found the new grid square where an army platoon was scattered across a poppy field taking fire from a fortified compound. The platoon leader was a sergeant first class whose voice carried the exhaustion of someone fighting a losing battle against superior numbers and better positions. "Revenant, we've got approximately 30 enemy fighters in a compound, RPGs and heavy machine guns. We're suppressed and taking casualties. Need you to put steel on that building." Cade studied the targeting pod display, saw the compound, saw the army positions, measured the distance. Danger close was an understatement. This was intimate violence, the kind where precision wasn't optional. "Sergeant, I'm going to put 2 Mavericks through their front door and then make a gun run on their supporting positions. When I call break, you move your people to that irrigation ditch on your east." "Copy." The sergeant's acknowledgement was immediate, trusting, the kind of faith that combat breeds when someone's proven they know their business. She pickled the Mavericks, watched them track true, impact with devastating effect that collapsed half the compound's front wall. Then she lined up for the gun run, knowing her ammunition counter was showing less than 300 rounds, knowing this was probably her last effective pass. The GAU-8 thundered, and she stitched fire across the compound's defensive positions with the same careful precision a surgeon uses with a scalpel. When she pulled up, fuel warning lights were illuminating across her panel. Time to go home, time to see if her math was right. "Sergeant, Revenant is Winchester and Bingo Fuel. Call if you need anything else." The sergeant's response was simple, heartfelt. "Ma'am, you just gave us our lives back. Thank you." She climbed toward Bagram, watching her fuel gauge drop, feeling the engines drink the last reserves. The approach to Bagram was instrument only, clouds solid from 10,000 feet down to a 100-foot ceiling, and her fuel quantity indicator was reading empty, running on unusable reserves and whatever fumes remained in the lines. She declared an emergency 20 miles out, cleared the pattern, had fire trucks standing by. The tower controller's voice was professionally calm with an undercurrent of tension. "Revenant 3-1, Your number 1 for landing, runway 21, winds variable at 8 knots, emergency equipment standing by. Cade acknowledged, ran through her emergency procedures configured for landing. Gear down. Flaps extended. Speed brakes ready. She was flying on instruments and instinct, watching the altimeter unwind, following the glide slope indicator, trusting the numbers because the world outside her canopy was gray nothing. At 500 feet, she broke through the clouds and the runway appeared, wet and shining, beautiful as anything she'd ever seen. The A-10 touched down smooth despite the crosswind, despite the empty tanks, despite everything. She rolled out, cleared the runway, and the left engine quit first. Then the right, starved of fuel exactly as she'd calculated. The aircraft coasted to a stop on the taxiway. Fire trucks surrounded her immediately, foam ready, crews tense. She shut down systems, opened the canopy, breathed the cool morning air. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline crash hitting delayed but inevitable. She'd flown 4 hours, engaged 6 separate targets, saved 2 different units, and landed on fumes. Another day at the office. Staff Sergeant Kowalski appeared beside the aircraft, looked up at her with an expression somewhere between awe and exasperation. "Ma'am, you just flamed out both engines on the taxiway." Cade started unstrapping, muscle memory disconnecting oxygen hose, comm cord, harness releases. Better than flaming out on final, Chief. He shook his head, made notes that would become maintenance records and eventually stories told in hangars across the Air Force. One of these days your luck's gonna run out. She climbed down from the cockpit, boots hitting concrete, felt her legs nearly buckle from exhaustion. The stories spread through military networks the way stories do when they're too good not to share, when they contain the kind of truth that transcends official reports and enters the realm of legend. In ready rooms across Afghanistan, pilots traded revenant stories over coffee and pre-flight briefs. The time she'd held station over a downed helicopter for 90 minutes despite fuel reserves that should have forced her to egress after 20. The time she'd talked a brand-new lieutenant through his first gun run while taking anti-aircraft fire that riddled her aircraft with holes. The time she'd landed with a malfunctioning nose gear and no hydraulics, skidding to a stop in the barrier cables like it was a routine maneuver. Captain Marcus Hale's SEAL team started wearing small A-10 patches on their kit, unofficial recognition of the pilot who'd saved them when everyone else said stand down. The Marine recon unit she'd pulled out of the riverbed sent her a combat knife engraved with coordinates and the date, a gift that waited for her in the mail room when she rotated back to stateside. The Army sergeant she'd supported wrote a letter to her commanding officer that became part of her permanent record, describing her actions with the kind of detailed praise that usually only comes posthumously. But Cade didn't collect the stories, didn't keep a tally, didn't measure her worth in missions flown or lives saved or awards accumulated. She flew because flying made sense in ways the rest of life didn't, because in the cockpit everything simplified to clear problems with definite solutions, because the aircraft didn't care about her losses or her grief or the empty spaces where her family used to be. It only cared whether she could fly it, and she could fly it better than almost anyone. Her commanding officer, Colonel Richard Vance, called her into his office 6 months into the deployment. He was career Air Force, 3 wars, 2,000 flight hours in fighters and attack aircraft, and he'd seen enough combat pilots to recognize the different species. Vance gestured for her to sit, closed the door, dropped the command formality. "Iris, I'm sending you home early." She froze, face unreadable, but he saw the flash of something in her eyes. Not relief, fear maybe, or loss. "Sir, my rotation isn't up for 2 months. I know, you've flown more hours than any other pilot in theater. You've got the highest mission effectiveness rating I've ever seen, and you're burning out." He said it gently, the way you tell someone hard truths when you respect them too much to lie. Cade shook her head. "I'm fine, sir. I can keep flying." Vance opened a folder, showed her the flight surgeon's notes, the fatigue assessments, the psychological evaluations that she'd aced because she knew the right answers but that showed warning signs to anyone trained to read between the lines. "You're not fine. You're running on empty, same as that aircraft you landed on fumes last week. I need you sharp, not martyred." She looked at the floor, jaw tight, fighting something internal that Vance could only guess at. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than he'd ever heard it. "What am I supposed to do back there, sir? Teach young pilots how to fly safe, push papers, wait for the next deployment." He understood then, saw the shape of what drove her, the hole she was trying to fill with missions and danger and the clean simplicity of combat. "You're supposed to remember that you're human, that you can't save everyone. That coming home isn't weakness." She met his eyes finally, and what he saw there was complicated gratitude and resentment and understanding all mixed together. "When do I leave?" "End of the week. I'm putting you in for the Silver Star. Captain Hale's DFC recommendation is already approved. You'll pin on full colonel next year if I have anything to say about it." She stood, saluted, professional mask back in place. "Thank you, sir." But they both knew she wasn't thanking him for the awards or the promotion. She was thanking him for caring enough to ground her before she killed herself, proving something to ghosts. The C-17 carrying her home lifted off from Bagram at dawn, banking west over mountains that looked peaceful from altitude, hiding the violence in their valleys. Cade sat in the canvas seating among other rotating personnel, duffel bag at her feet, flight suit rumpled, staring at nothing in particular. A young airman across from her, 19 maybe, worked up the courage to speak. "Ma'am, are you Revenant, the A-10 pilot?" She nodded without looking at him. "Yes." His face lit up with the kind of hero worship that made her uncomfortable. "I heard about you. Everyone has. They say you're the best combat pilot in theater." Cade turned to face him fully, and her expression was kind but firm, carrying wisdom earned in ways she'd never fully explain. "The best pilots are the ones who bring everyone home and don't make it look heroic. The ones who turn down missions that are too dangerous. The ones who know when to say no." The airman looked confused. "But you never say no." She smiled, sad and knowing. "Exactly, don't be like me." The rest of the flight passed in silence. Below, Afghanistan scrolled past in browns and grays, a country she'd spent years trying to protect, filled with people whose names she'd never know who were alive because she'd been willing to fly into situations others wouldn't. But the math was getting harder, the fuel margins tighter, the decisions more weighted with consequence. Colonel Vance was right, though she'd never tell him that. She was running on empty, had been for years, using combat as medication for grief that wouldn't heal any other way. The question she couldn't answer was what came next. What happened when the mission ended and she had to face the silence? When there were no more valleys to fly into, no more troops in contact, no more clear problems with definite solutions. Just herself and the memories and the vast empty sky. Stateside felt wrong, like wearing clothes that didn't fit anymore, navigating a world whose problems seemed simultaneously trivial and insurmountable. Cade took 2 weeks leave, drove to Kentucky, visited graves she hadn't seen in 3 years. The headstones were weathered now, the grass grown over, the flowers she paid a service to maintain looking fresh despite her absence. She sat on the ground between her parents' graves and her brother's family plot, and tried to find words that had been stuck in her throat since the night she got the news deployed in Kandahar. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I keep choosing missions over everything else. I'm sorry I don't know how to stop." The graves didn't answer. The wind moved through the cemetery trees, carrying the smell of cut grass and distant rain. She stayed until sunset, then drove back to her empty apartment near base, the one she paid rent on but barely lived in, decorated with furniture she'd bought in a single afternoon from a discount store because permanence felt like a lie she couldn't afford to believe. Her phone rang. "Colonel Vance." "Iris, we need you at the schoolhouse. I want you teaching combat tactics to the next generation of A-10 pilots. You've got more real-world experience than the entire instructor cadre combined." She looked around her apartment, seeing it like a stranger might, recognizing the transient nature of everything in her life. "When do I start?" "Next month. It's not flying combat, but it's important. These kids need to learn from someone who's actually done it, who can teach them not just how to fly but why we fly." Cade nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Okay, I'll be there." After she hung up, she sat in the dark apartment, feeling something shift. Maybe this was the mission now. Not flying into valleys herself, but preparing others to do it. teaching the next generation how to make the hard calls, how to calculate fuel versus lives, how to fly aircraft that shouldn't stay airborne but do anyway because the pilot refuses to quit. The classroom at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base held 26 student pilots, fresh from flight training, excited and nervous and convinced they were immortal. Cade stood at the front in her flight suit, no notes, no PowerPoint, just 377 combat sorties worth of lessons distilled into hard truths. The A-10 is not a glamorous aircraft. It's slow. It's ugly. Fighter pilots make jokes about it. But it's the most honest airplane you'll ever fly because it doesn't pretend to be anything except exactly what it is. A gun that flies, built to take punishment and keep fighting. She clicked to a photo of her old aircraft, the one she'd landed on fumes, scarred and battered and still flying. This bird took RPG shrapnel, small arms fire, lost hydraulics twice, flew on one engine more times than maintenance wanted to know about, and never quit. Know why? Because the pilot didn't quit. That's the real lesson. The aircraft will match your commitment. You decide whether to turn back or press, and the A-10 will follow you into hell if that's where you point it. A student raised his hand, young Lieutenant Ernest. "Ma'am, how do you know when it's worth the risk? When to press versus when to pull off?" Cade considered the question, the weight of it, the lives it represented. You calculate everything you can: fuel, weapons, weather, threats. You run the numbers. Then you add one more variable: who dies if you don't try? If the math works and the need is real, you go. But you go smart, not stupid. There's no honor in getting yourself killed accomplishing nothing. Another student, older, maybe prior, enlisted. What if the math doesn't work? She met his eyes, recognized someone asking the real question underneath. Then you find a way to make it work, or you accept that you can't save everyone and live with that decision. Both options will haunt you differently. Choose the one you can carry. The class went silent, understanding they were receiving something beyond tactics and procedures. The months turned into a year, and Cade found rhythm in teaching, discovered she could translate combat experience into lessons that might keep young pilots alive. She taught them how to read weather, how to calculate danger-close fire, how to communicate with ground forces under stress. Taught them the difference between courage and recklessness, between calculated risk and suicide. Taught them that every mission was a conversation between pilot and aircraft, and the aircraft would tell you what it could handle if you learned to listen. But at night, alone in her apartment, she struggled. The quiet was too loud, the safety too uncertain. She'd wake from dreams of valleys and gunfire, reach for flight controls that weren't there, feel the phantom press of G-forces that existed only in memory. The VA doctor she finally visited was kind, professional, used terms like PTSD and survivor's guilt, and suggested medication she didn't take because she needed to stay sharp, needed to be ready in case they called her back. "You're not in combat anymore," the doctor said gently. "You're allowed to rest." Cade smiled without humor. "I don't know how." But slowly, session by session, she started learning. Started understanding that the grief she'd been medicating with missions wasn't going to disappear, but it could coexist with life if she gave it space instead of burying it under adrenaline and purpose. Started recognizing that teaching young pilots was still saving lives, just in a different way, with a longer timeline. Started believing that maybe coming home wasn't defeat. One afternoon, a student approached her after class. "Young woman, call sign Torch," reminded Cade of herself a decade earlier. "Ma'am, I heard you landed an A-10 on one engine with no fuel. They say you've never turned down a mission, never left troops unsupported. I want to be like you." Cade looked at her for a long moment, seeing herself reflected, seeing the dangerous commitment in those young eyes. "No," she said firmly. "You want to be better than me." The confusion on Torch's face was immediate. "Ma'am, I don't understand." Cade gestured for her to sit, dropped the instructor formality. "I flew every mission like it might be my last because part of me didn't care if it was. I took risks that worked out but shouldn't have. I said yes when smarter pilots would have said no. And I survived through skill and luck, but mostly luck, and that's not a strategy." She paused, choosing words carefully because this mattered more than any tactical briefing. "You want to be the pilot who brings everyone home, including yourself, who knows when to press and when to pull off, who calculates risk without letting grief or anger or pride make the decision. That's better than being me. Torch processed this, young enough to still think invincibility was possible, old enough to hear the truth underneath. What changed? How do you know when enough is enough? Cade thought about graves in Kentucky, about aircraft landed on fumes, about Colonel Vance forcing her to come home before she killed herself proving things to ghosts. Someone made me stop long enough to realize I was trying to outrun pain instead of processing it, that I was using combat as medication, that the best way to honor the people I lost wasn't dying in their place but living in their memory. The student nodded slowly. Is that what you're doing now? Living in their memory? I'm trying. It was honest, raw, more than she usually shared. Some days are better than others, but teaching you how to come home alive feels like better math than proving I'm willing to die. After Torch left, Cade sat alone in the empty classroom, surrounded by tactical maps and aircraft diagrams, and felt something like peace. Not complete, not perfect, but real. The kind of peace that doesn't erase pain but makes room for it alongside everything else. She thought about all the valleys she'd flown into, all the troops she'd supported, all the missions that had seemed like the only thing that mattered. They did matter. But so did this passing knowledge forward, preparing the next generation, building a legacy that wasn't measured in near-death experiences, but in pilots who learned to make better decisions. 2 years into teaching, she got a call from Captain Hale. He'd retired from the SEALs, was working private security, happened to be passing through Arizona. They met at a bar near base, two veterans navigating civilian spaces that felt foreign despite their best efforts. Hale looked older, grayer, carried himself with the same controlled competence, but something in his eyes was softer now. I wanted to thank you in person, he said over beer neither of them was really drinking. My men talk about that day like it was yesterday. The sound of your gun run, the fact you stayed when you should have left. Cade shook her head. You'd have done the same. Maybe, but I didn't have to. You did. He paused, measured his words. I looked you up afterward, read about your family, tried to understand what makes someone fly like you flew. I think I get it now. She met his eyes, curious and cautious. And what do you get? That you were trying to make their deaths mean something by making sure nobody else died on your watch. That every mission was a chance to rewrite an ending you couldn't change. He said it without judgment, with the understanding of someone who'd carried his own ghosts through firefights and extraction points. Cade felt her throat tight, nodded because words weren't coming easy. Does it get better? Hale smiled, genuine and sad. Yeah, not perfect, but better. You start remembering the good parts instead of just the end. You start building new memories instead of living in old ones. You forgive yourself for not being there, for not being able to save everyone. They sat in silence for a while, two people who'd seen too much finding comfort in shared understanding. Eventually, Hale raised his beer. To Revenant, the pilot who taught a SEAL captain that courage looks different than he thought. Cade raised her glass, clinked it against his. To second chances. Even when we don't think we deserve them. The beer tasted better after that. 5 years after leaving Afghanistan, Iris, Revenant, Cade stood at a podium addressing the Air Force Weapons School, invited as a guest lecturer on close air support tactics. Full colonel now, though she still felt most comfortable in a flight suit despite the administrative duties that came with rank. The auditorium was packed with pilots from every airframe, all listening as she walked through the famous Valley engagement, the single-engine flight, the decisions made in seconds that meant life or death. But she didn't tell it like a war story. She told it like a cautionary tale, highlighting every place where luck saved her, every decision that could have gone wrong, every moment where better options existed if she'd been thinking clearly instead of running on grief and adrenaline, and the desperate need to save someone since she hadn't saved the people who mattered most. The best close air support pilot isn't the one who takes the most risks, she said, scanning the audience, seeing young faces hungry for glory and older faces marked by experience. It's the one who completes the mission and comes home, because you can't support troops tomorrow if you're dead today. Calculate your risks, know your limits, and understand that saying no to one mission might mean being alive for 10 more. After the lecture, a brigadier general approached her. Colonel Cade, that was remarkably honest. Most guest lecturers talk about their successes, not their near failures. Cade smiled. Sir, if my near failures keep someone else from making them actual failures, that seems like time well spent. The general studied her, nodded slowly. We're standing up a new combat tactics development program. Need someone with real-world experience to lead it. Interested. She considered it, weighed the choice against the person she'd been versus the person she was becoming. Will I have to stop teaching? You'd be teaching at a higher level, developing the doctrine the next generation uses. It felt right in ways combat had felt right, but healthier, more sustainable, building instead of burning. Yes, sir, I'm interested. That night she called her brother's widow, a conversation that happened monthly now instead of never. They talked about the nephews, about normal things, about life continuing despite grief. The legacy of Revenant wasn't in the awards or the stories or the dramatic rescues, though those existed in official records and unofficial legends told in ready rooms across the Air Force. The real legacy lived in the pilots she taught, the ones who learned to make hard decisions with clear eyes instead of clouded judgment, who understood that courage meant choosing life when death would have been easier, who flew missions because troops needed support, not because pilots needed redemption. Lieutenant Torch, made captain, flew 2 combat deployments, brought everyone home both times, credited her instructor with teaching her that the mission was bringing people home, not proving personal fearlessness. Captain Marcus Hale's son joined the Air Force, became a combat controller, worked with A-10s in Syria, wrote his father about a pilot who reminded him of the stories he'd grown up hearing about someone called Revenant. Staff Sergeant Kowalski retired, opened a bar near Davis Monthan called the Titanium Bathtub, filled it with A-10 memorabilia and photos of pilots he'd maintained aircraft for over 30 years, kept one photo above the bar of a scarred A-10 with empty fuel tanks and one dead engine, and a pilot who'd refused to quit. And Iris Cade, who'd once measured her worth in missions flown and lives saved, and the distance she could maintain from her own grief, learned slowly that legacy wasn't built in single dramatic moments, but in sustained commitment to something larger than personal pain. She still flew when she could, still felt most alive in the cockpit, but she'd stopped using flight as escape and started using it as expression of skill, of passion, of the thing she loved doing most in a world that finally had room for more than just mission and mourning. She kept her family's photos on her desk now instead of buried in her wallet, visited their graves regularly, told stories about them to friends instead of hiding the loss. Let herself remember the good years instead of just the terrible end. And some nights, when the moon was bright and the air was clear, she'd stand outside and look at the sky and feel connected to something larger, to every pilot who'd ever chosen to fly toward danger instead of away from it, to every troop who'd heard engines overhead and known salvation was coming, to every person who'd learned that the hardest courage wasn't facing death, but choosing life after loss. The sky remained vast and indifferent and beautiful. The A-10s kept flying, kept bringing people home, kept proving that sometimes the ugliest aircraft carried the most heart. And Iris, Revenant Cade, who'd once flown into hell on one engine and fumes because SEALs needed saving and she needed purpose, found something she'd stopped believing existed. A life worth living even when the mission was over. Years later, when they asked her about that day in the valley, about the single-engine flight and the impossible decisions, she'd smile and tell them the truth. I did what needed doing, but the real courage came later when I had to learn that survival meant more than just not dying. It meant building a life worth the risks I'd taken. And in that answer lived the full circle, from the pilot who couldn't stop flying toward death to the leader who taught others how to fly toward life. The call sign remained. Revenant, the one who keeps coming back, but what she came back to had changed. Not to combat, not to grief, not to the desperate need to prove worth through danger. She came back to purpose, to teaching, to legacy, to the understanding that saving lives could happen in classrooms as surely as in valleys, and that the troops who needed support included the young pilot looking for guidance, the struggling veteran trying to transition home, the person in the mirror who'd finally learned to forgive herself for being human. The A-10s kept flying, titanium bathtubs protecting pilots who'd learned from her lessons, carrying forward the tradition of the close air support mission. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, in a classroom filled with tactical maps and eager students, Revenant taught another generation that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the choice to act despite it, that honor wasn't dying for the mission but living for the people who needed you, and that the finest legacy any warrior could leave was a world where fewer warriors were needed. The sky called still. It always would. But now when she flew towards something instead of away from it. And that made all the difference.